Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are putting on our detective hats and cracking open one of the most agonizing case files in American history. We're taking a hard look at the Green River Killer investigation. As an investigator, looking back at this one is incredibly frustrating. We're going to see exactly where those early police tactics went fatally wrong and how a massive evolution in forensic science finally brought a real-life monster to justice. So let's start with the million-dollar question, right? How does a single man with an estimated 80 to 90 victims manage to evade justice for nearly 2 decades, especially when his name was already sitting right there on the suspect list? How does an investigation fail so fundamentally, and what did it actually take to finally correct course? To figure that out, we're going to walk through this investigative postmortem in 5 quick steps. The initial investigation, profiling the unseen killer, tactical failures and blind spots, limits of 1980s forensics, and finally, the genetic breakthrough. All right, Section 1, the initial investigation, hunting the most vulnerable. Let's head back to the horrifying circumstances unfolding in the summer of 1982 in Washington state. From a purely tactical standpoint, the killer had a terrifyingly effective strategy. He deliberately targeted the most vulnerable people he could find, mostly teenage runaways and street workers along the Pacific Avenue South Strip near the Seattle-Tacoma airport. Because of their transient lifestyles, tracing their movements was basically impossible for detectives. And the really tragic part? Their disappearances frequently went totally unreported and, early on, largely uninvestigated. He completely exploited that societal apathy, which gave him a massive head start before law enforcement even realized they had a serial killer on the loose. And this brilliantly illustrates his early counter-forensic measures. He wasn't just killing, he was actively working to destroy the crime scenes. By stripping victims of their clothing and jewelry, stuff that usually harbors trace evidence like fibers or hairs, and by dumping those early bodies directly into the Green River, he let the water literally wash away the physical evidence. And when police actually started finding those first few bodies, he adapted instantly, shifting his dump sites to dry land and remote wooded areas. The guy was actively evolving his tactics to stay one step ahead of the cops. Moving to Section 2, profiling the unseen killer, the Bundy consultation. Completely baffled by the killer's ability to leave zero trace, investigators did something highly unorthodox. They turned to an already captured serial killer for tactical advice. Ted Bundy. Sitting in prison, Bundy gave them a chillingly accurate behavioral profile. He told detectives that the killer was likely returning to his victims' bodies to relive the crimes. His tactical advice was bold. He said, if you find a fresh body, don't move in. Set up a covert surveillance network in the area under the cover of darkness and just wait for him to come back. Now here is the absolute kicker. That behavioral profile was completely accurate. The killer was returning to the dump sites. But law enforcement fundamentally failed to execute the tactical trap. They couldn't pull off the surveillance without tipping their hand. It was a massive, squandered opportunity to catch the killer red-handed. Which brings us to Section 3, tactical failures and blind spots, investigative missed opportunities. This is the core of our case review, looking at the catastrophic human errors that allowed this rampage to continue right under the noses of the police. If you're evaluating this timeline today, this sequence of near misses over a 5-year period is absolutely agonizing. In 1983, a victim's boyfriend literally followed the suspect's truck right to his house. The cops visited the home, looked around, saw nothing, and just left. Time and time again, the suspect, Gary Ridgway, was right in the crosshairs, and time again, subjective police work let him slip right through their fingers. You really have to look at the stark juxtaposition here between the flawed, subjective testing of the era and the horrifying objective reality. May of 1984, police bring Ridgway in and hook him up to a polygraph. The result? No deception detected. He passed. Meanwhile, back in reality, Ridgway had already murdered upwards of 40 women. Because polygraphs rely so heavily on physiological stress responses, a true psychopath who feels literally zero guilt can easily beat them. Law enforcement put way too much faith in a flawed tool. And the failures just kept compounding. We see a massive tactical failure in 1985 when a detective completely dismissed a surviving victim's assault report against Ridgway. The detective's notes actually blamed the victim, suggesting the encounter might teach him a lesson, and then close the file. Instead of recognizing the escalating violence of a serial killer, subjective biases and victim blaming completely blinded the investigators. They gave him a free pass to actively terrorize the region. So why did police keep overlooking him? A huge part of it was his profile. Gary Ridgway managed to mask his severe psychopathy behind a terrifyingly dull and unremarkable facade. He held a steady job as a truck painter for decades, he was clean-cut, managed 3 marriages, and was even described by a surviving victim as simply boring and dull. He didn't look like a raving lunatic. That put his victims at ease, and it fundamentally conflicted with the subjective biases of what investigators thought a monster should look like. On to Section 4, Limits of 1980s Forensics, the 1987 Evidence. Let's look at the pivotal year where investigators finally grab a crucial piece of physical evidence, but immediately hit a technological brick wall. During one of their interviews with Ridgway in 1987, investigators actually had the foresight to collect a saliva sample. Think about that for a second. They literally had the killer's DNA in their hands, but DNA testing was in its absolute infancy. They lacked the scientific tools to definitively match that sample to the tiny bits of biological trace evidence found at the crime scenes. So the sample went into a storage locker, and Gary Ridgway walked free once again. Section 5. The Genetic Breakthrough. Science Catches Up. Fortunately, the story does not end in the 80s. Science eventually caught up in 2001, completely removing human subjectivity from the equation. The absolute game changer here was short tandem repeat, or STR profiling. Basically, it's a highly sensitive forensic technique that allows scientists to produce a comprehensive genetic profile from incredibly small, old, or degraded biological samples. It was the exact forensic key they needed to unlock decades of preserved, untestable evidence just sitting in the Seattle police lockers. So in 2001, scientists pulled out that dusty saliva sample from 1987 and hit it with STR testing. The result was completely indisputable. The genetic profile from Ridgway's saliva was a direct match to the biological evidence recovered from 4 of the early victims. Science finally provided the undeniable objective proof that polygraphs, stakeouts, and subjective interviews had totally missed. Ridgway was immediately arrested. When we evaluate the methods used in this case, the contrast is just staggering. Back in the 1980s, relying on polygraphs, visual stakeouts, and subjective interviews clouded by bias allowed the suspect to evade capture, resulting in a massive loss of life. Fast forward to the 2000s, and by relying on proper evidence preservation and the cold, hard science of STR genetic profiling, investigators nailed a direct biological match and got a swift conviction. Confronted with that undeniable DNA evidence, Gary Ridgway eventually confessed. In 2003, he was sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. A 49th life sentence was actually added years later as more remains were finally identified. But look, the tragedy extends far beyond those 49 convictions. Experts estimate the actual count of vulnerable teenage girls and women who fell prey to Ridgway's diabolical undertaking is somewhere between 80 to 90 victims. The sheer, staggering scale of his crimes makes him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, and it stands as a dark monument to the catastrophic failure of those early investigative methods. As we close this case file, the Green River investigation leaves us with a pretty haunting realization about why evidence preservation is everything. It makes you wonder, with unidentified remains still sitting in evidence lockers all across the country, what other monsters are currently hiding in cold case files, just waiting for forensic technology to take its next major leap and finally give those victims a voice? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the evidence.